Hi everyone, I'm Andy, and today I have another viewer-requested video for you. This will be a little bit different from content that I've made in the past. So far, this has been a code-first channel, and we have primarily focused on detailed explanations of Autogen projects written in Python. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Autogen Studio, which is a new web UI created by the Autogen team for the purposes of rapidly prototyping Autogen agents and their interactions. There's a lot to cover here, and I may end up creating more than one video on this topic. Today, we're going to focus on an overview of Autogen Studio, and we're going to set up some basic agent interactions, as well as a slightly more complicated group interaction scenario. By the end of this video, you should have a good general grasp of what you can do with Autogen Studio and how you can use it to test agents that you plan to use in your own projects. Just as a quick note before we begin, I have received a number of video requests over the past few weeks, and I just want to let you know that I'm still going to be working on those. Also, Autogen Studio is very new, so just keep in mind that things may not always work smoothly, and there may be a few bugs along the way. So with all that in mind, let's dive in. So as you've probably noticed, I'm not using Visual Studio Code for this video. All I have open is a basic terminal window, and also a browser window that we're going to be using to interact with Autogen Studio once we get it up and running. So we're going to start this project off the same way that we've done in the past. The first thing that we're going to do is create a new conda environment for the work that we'll be doing. So I'm going to do that with the command conda create-n, which allows me to give it a name. The name that I'm choosing is Autogen_Studio. And then I'm going to specify the version of Python that we'll use by saying Python equals 3.11.3. So I will hit enter. And this is going to ask me if I would like to proceed and install all of these packages, and I will say yes. And now that our new conda environment has been created, I need to go ahead and activate it. I'm going to do that with the command conda activate Autogen_Studio, which was the name that we chose for our conda environment. Just like we've done in previous videos, I'm going to run the command which python3, and what that's going to do is that's going to tell me exactly where Python is installed on disk for this specific conda environment. Now that we know where Python is installed for our environment, I'm going to specifically reference that exact version just to double, triple, quadruple check that I'm not going to have any sort of package conflicts or any other sorts of package management issues. So I'm going to say python 3-m pip install Autogen Studio. This is going to take just a moment to install, so I'm going to cut to when it's done. All right, so the installation is done, and as you'll notice, this command has installed Autogen Studio, and it has also installed PyAutogen into our conda environment. Now that we have everything installed, we're still not quite ready to get started. The next thing that we need to do is actually create a reference to our API key. In previous videos, we've done this using a file that's in our project. Well, we don't have a project here, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to create an environment variable that Autogen Studio can use while it's running. The way that I'm going to do that is with the command export OpenAI_API_key equals, and then I'm going to give it my API key. Now I'll run that command. And so this has created our environment variable that holds our API key. And just to double check that that worked, I'm going to say echo $OpenAI_API_key, and I should see my API key, which I do. So just a quick reminder, just like we've done in previous videos, I'm going to revoke this API key before publishing this video. So with that all done, now we're actually ready to run Autogen Studio. The way that we do that is with the command Autogen Studio space UI space -- port space 8081. In this example, I'm using port 8081. You can really use whatever port that you want to, as long as it's not already in use. So I will run this command. And as we can see here, started server process running on HTTP 127.0.0.1 port 8081. Now I'm going to resize these windows just a little bit, but I'm going to leave the terminal open. Up here in the address bar, I'm actually going to navigate to this address, localhost :8081. And so now we're presented with the Autogen Studio UI. So the first thing to notice, up here at the top, you can see 3 tabs: Build, Playground, and Gallery. So Build is the tab where we're going to be able to do things such as defining custom functions for agents to use, defining agents, defining models, and defining workflows that specify interactions between different agents to accomplish some task. The playground is the place where you can go to actually test these various workflows and agents that you've created. And the gallery is a place that you can save snapshots of playground sessions to reference later. The first thing that I'm going to do is go over to this Build tab. When this opens up, you'll see on the left-hand side a number of interesting things: skills, models, agents, and workflows. Skills is the interface where you can define customized functionality for your agents. Models is where you can define what models your agents should have access to. Agents, as the name implies, is where you'll be defining your agents. And workflows is where you're going to design various interactions between the agents that you've created. So let's go and take a look at some of these things. I'm going to start here at the top of the list with skills. So as you can see, Autogen Studio comes with a few predefined functions just to get you started. Let's take a look at one of them. I'm going to click on Generate Images. And as we can see here, this is essentially just a plain Python function. Up at the top, we have a number of imports. We have a function definition. We have a comment section that describes what this function does. And then we have what amounts to basically just plain Python code. As far as I'm aware, there are no real limitations with what you can do here. For example, here we even have an OpenAI client being created, and we're calling that client's image generation endpoint. So right off the bat, in one of the example functions, we have an example of essentially doing an API call right here from within one of these functions. So I'm going to cancel out of here. Now I'm going to go take a look at the models view. As you can see, Autogen Studio comes with a few predefined model definitions. Before we look at those, I would like to draw your attention to this note here at the top of the panel. Note, when you reuse a model in your agent workflow, a copy of the model details is added to the agent workflow. So that means that if I make a model definition and I use that in an agent, then I come back here and I change something about that model, that change is not going to be reflected in the agent or workflow that I've already added it to. I'm going to have to go in, delete the model, and re-add it to that agent or workflow. So let's take a look at a couple of these. So right here we have an Azure OpenAI model configuration for GPT-4. So this is where you're going to enter things such as your Azure base URL, your Azure API key, as well as a number of other parameters. And as the note says in the bottom here, for Azure OpenAI models, you will need to specify all fields. So I'm going to hit OK. The next definition in the list is a GPT-4 Turbo configuration. And the only thing that we've really specified here is the model name that we want to use. The API key for OpenAI is already in the environment variable that we created a little earlier in this video. The base URL is already known to Autogen Studio, so you don't have to supply it here. I will hit OK. And the last one here is an example of what you might need to do if you're running an LLM locally. As you can see, this one is specifying Zephyr 7B alpha. For this model, we do not need an API key, but we do have specified the endpoint where this model is being run locally. So I'm going to hit OK. So for the purposes of this video, I don't have an Azure API key, so I'm going to delete this model. And I also don't have anything running locally, so I'm going to delete this model as well. So this just leaves us with GPT-4 Turbo, which is what we're going to be using for the models in the rest of this video. So let's go and take a look at those agents. So Autogen Studio comes with a couple of agents predefined just to get you started, just like with the skills and just like with the models. So let's take a look at the user proxy. So if you've followed my previous videos, or if you've worked on your own with Autogen, you should see some familiar things here. For example, the agent has a name, there's a description for the agent, there is a max consecutive auto reply so that the agent doesn't just keep saying the same thing over and over again. There's a human input mode, a system message, and we can also give this agent a model or list of models, and a skill or a list of skills. So I'm going to cancel out of this, and let's look at the primary assistant. Now the primary assistant is defined exactly the same way as the user proxy. It has a name, a description, max consecutive auto reply, human input mode. This one has been given a system message. This one has been given a model, and this one has also been given a couple of skills: find papers on archive and generate images. So let's cancel out of here, and let's go and take a look at how these agents are being used. If I go over to the workflows view, we can see 3 predefined workflows: general agent workflow, travel agent group chat, and visualization agent workflow. Let's take a look at the general agent workflow and see how it's configured. So the workflow definitions are fairly simple. You can give them a name, a description, a summary method, and then a sender and receiver. As you can see here, the sender is set to user proxy and the receiver is set to the primary assistant. And both of these agents are the ones that we saw defined in the agents view. For the summary method, you have a number of different ways that you can configure this: last, none, and LLM. And we're going to come back to those a little bit later in the video. I'll explain them in a few minutes. So I'm going to cancel out of this. Now let's see one of these workflows in action. So I'm going to go over here to the Playground tab, and I'm going to create a new session, and I'm going to choose the general agent workflow, and I will say create, and I'm just going to give it a simple prompt to test things out, something like paint a picture of a cat wearing a tuxedo. And to send that message, I'll just hit enter. Hi everyone, this is Andy, and I wanted to quickly pause the video for a moment and draw your attention to the fact that if you notice, in the left-hand side of my screen in the console, there's actually an error right now. And if you look down here at the bottom left corner of my screen, you can see that the error message is saying that there's been an incorrect API key that has been provided. And the incorrect key that's been provided is sk-sample key. Now, if you remember from the beginning of the video, we already set the API key using the environment variable export. So in order to figure out what the problem was, I did a few things. I tried the prompt again. I added my API key directly to the model definition inside of Autogen Studio. I deleted the model from the agent and I added it back. I deleted the skills that the agent had and I added them back to the agent. And I also added a model to the user proxy itself just to see if perhaps the problem was that the user proxy was trying to make an API call but was unable to. Now this did actually end up working, but we shouldn't need to have a model on the user proxy in order for this to work. So what I did is I went back and I deleted the model from the user proxy and I tried again, and then from that point forward everything seemed to work okay. So just keep in mind, like we said in the beginning of the video, Autogen Studio is very new and there's bound to be some bugs or problems or little hangups here and there along the way. So with that in mind, let's get back to the video. So I'm just going to give this a simple message to get started, something like paint a picture of a cat wearing a tuxedo. And this is going to take a few moments to run, so I'm going to cut to when it's finished. All right, so it's finished, and I'd like to draw your attention to a couple of things. First of all, if you look at the terminal on the left-hand side of the screen, you should be seeing something very familiar to you at this point. We can see In the terminal, the user proxy relays our prompt to the primary assistant. The primary assistant says back to the user proxy, hey, here's some Python code that we can run to accomplish this task. Then the user proxy actually executes that code, and the primary assistant says the image of a cat wearing a tuxedo has been successfully generated, etc., etc. Terminate, which stops the conversation between the two agents. So we can see that the entire conversation has been printed to the console. So just as a note, whenever you have a session based off of a workflow, all of the information that gets passed back and forth gets printed to the console. So back here in Autogen Studio, as you can see, it's presented us with the picture that it created. Here is the cat wearing the tuxedo. It's also presented us with the Python code that it created and ran. Also, the entire conversation between the agents is printed here as well. User proxy, paint a picture of a cat. Primary assistant, here's some Python code. User proxy executes the code. The primary assistant gives a summary when everything is done. Take special note of what the primary assistant says here at the end. The image of a cat wearing a tuxedo has been successfully generated and saved with this file name. If we go back up here to the top and collapse the conversation, collapse the results, we can see our prompt, paint a picture of a cat wearing a tuxedo, and then we can also see that same message. The image of a cat wearing a tuxedo has been successfully generated, etc., etc. Now, this is very important. This was the last message in the agent conversation. Now, keep that in mind. That was the last message. Let's go back to the Build tab and look at these workflows again. In the General Agent workflow, you can see the summary method defines the method to summarize the conversation. Right now, we have it set to last. If I cancel out of here, go back to the playground, go back to our session, when the conversation is done, what this is going to do is this is going to print the last message in the conversation for you to give you an idea of what happened. There are a couple of other options in the workflow definitions. One of them is none. So when you have none selected, at the end of an agent conversation, it doesn't print anything. It just gives you a reference to the whole conversation, and you can go through and read it yourself. The last option for summary method is LLM, and I think that this is intended to use an agent to summarize the entire conversation and give you a synopsis of what happened once the conversation has finished taking place. And the reason that I say I think that's what it's supposed to do is because I actually haven't been able to get this to work yet. Your experience may be different than mine, but every time I've tried to use the LLM option, I get the same behavior as if I was to select none, which means when the conversation is done, no summary is printed. So let's cancel out of here and go back to our playground session, and I'm going to click on these three dots in our session, and I'm going to click on this button that says Publish. And as you can see, we get a message, session successfully published. And what that does, if we go over here to the gallery tab, now we can see our session has been recorded in the gallery, and we can go back and reference it at any time in the future. And if I click, you can see that this is actually very similar to the way that you can share conversations with ChatGPT. When you share a link to your conversation, anybody with that link can come back and look at the conversation, but they can't really interact with it further. Now, OpenAI gives you the option to continue that conversation using your own account, but so far there's nothing like that here in Autogen Studio. So now that we have a brief overview of Autogen Studio and the kinds of things that it can do, let's go back and define some skills, agents, and workflows of our own. So I'm going to go back to the Build tab. I'm going to go to the Skills UI, and I'm going to create my own custom skill. So I'll click on New Skill. I'm going to give it a name. I will call it Console Print. As you can see here, there's some sample Python code, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to replace it with a very simple Python function that basically just prints words that it's given to the console. If you've been following this channel, this should actually look pretty familiar to you. This was the same function that we used in our video about function calling with Autogen Agents. So now that we have this defined, I'm going to say OK. Next, I'm going to go to the Agent UI and I'm going to create a new agent. I'm going to call it Console Assistant. I'm going to give it a description. Prints to the console. I'm going to give it a system message. This system message was also taken from the previous video that we did on function calling. This already knows about our GPT model definition, so I'm going to come down here to the skills section and I'm going to add console print. So that's all we really need to do to define the console assistant. So I'm going to say OK. The next thing that I'd like to do is make a workflow that uses this console assistant. So I'm going to go to the workflows UI, make a new workflow for 2 agents. I'm going to call this console print workflow. I'm going to give it a description, a workflow to print words to the console. I'm going to leave the summary method as the default last. The sender is user proxy. I'm happy with that, but the receiver, primary assistant, I would like to actually replace this with the console assistant. So this workflow started off with user proxy and primary assistant. And as you can see right here, this says modify current agent. So I could create a modified version of primary assistant on the fly here if I so choose. But if you look down at the very bottom of this UI, it also says, or replace with an existing agent. So here is where I could do something like if I have a whole list of agents, I could replace this with another one, such as user proxy. I could replace it with primary assistant, or I could replace it with console assistant, which is the one that I want. And as you can see right here in the skills section, it says that there's one skill, console print. So I will say OK, and then I will hit OK. Now that we have our console print workflow defined, let's actually try it out in the playground. So I'm going to create a new session. I will select our console print workflow, press create. Then I'm going to give it a simple message such as, please print for me some words of 3 that I may see on the console of thee. I'm going to let this run for just a moment and I'm going to cut to when it's done. All right, it looks like we're done, and let's take a look at what happened. So over here in the terminal window on the left-hand side, you can see the user proxy relaying our message to the console assistant. Console assistant comes up with some Python code, and the user proxy executes it, and then the console assistant essentially closes out the conversation. Let's take a quick look at the Python code that the console assistant came up with. If I click on this, right away, you can see the first line, from skills, import console print. So our console assistant knew that it needed to call this particular predefined function. And then later on in the script, it goes ahead and actually calls that function that we've defined. Now that we've defined our own 2 agents, and we've set up a conversation just between the 2 of them, let's see a more complicated workflow that uses more than 2 agents in a group chat setting. Let's close this out. Let's go back to the build window. So I'm going to go to the agent UI and I'm going to define a couple more agents that we can use in our workflow. So for the console print assistant and workflow, what we did was we used code and agent definitions from a previous video on function calling with Autogen agents. So for a group chat, we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to define a new agent called conversation moderator. I'm going to give it a description. It moderates conversations. I'm going to give it a system message from a previous video. You are the conversation initiator and moderator. Your role is to provide a platform for 2 agents to engage in a discussion, etc. Everything looks good, so I'm going to say OK. I'm going to define one of my debate agents. I will call it Sam, and Sam advocates for advanced tech in daily life. I will give Sam a system message that says as much, and I'm going to say OK. I'm going to create another debate agent called Bob, and Bob advocates for caution with advanced tech in daily life. And I'm going to give Bob a system message of its own that defines the way that it should act and debate. I will say OK. Now I'm going to go to the workflow UI and I'm going to create a new workflow. Instead of 2 agents, I'm going to select group chat. So I'm going to call this tech conversation workflow. And the description is creates a debate about responsible tech between agents. Summary method, I'm going to leave as the default. The sender, I'm going to leave as the default user proxy. And the receiver has been set up with a group chat assistant by default. So I'm going to click on it. And as we can see here, by default, it just has a couple of instances of the primary assistant in its list. So I'm going to delete those, and I'm going to add the conversation moderator. I'm going to add Sam, and I'm going to add Bob. Next, I'm going to give the group chat assistant a system message of its own, stipulating that it's going to host a conversation, etc., etc., and I will say OK. Our workflow specification is done, so I'm going to say OK, and let's go over to the playground and start a session with this workflow. So I'll say new tech conversation workflow, create, and I will give it a simple message to kick it off, something like please begin. Hit enter. So right away, you might notice that something has gone wrong. If you look over here in the terminal window on the left, you can see that the first thing that happens is that the user proxy relays our message, please begin, to the group chat assistant. But then you can see that the primary assistant chimes in and says, hello, how can I assist you today? So as I said at the beginning of the video, Autogen Studio is very, very new, and there might be a few bumps along the way. And so it looks like we're running into one right now. We saved our workflow with Sam, Bob, and the conversation moderator, but here we have the primary assistant chiming in, so it looks like our workflow didn't get saved properly. That's okay. We'll go back to the Build tab, and we'll go back to our conversation workflow, and we'll click back on the group chat assistant. And as we can see, sure enough, our group chat agent list did not get saved properly. Everything else looks fine, including the system message that we gave to the group chat assistant. Our agent list is just wrong. So let's try deleting these again and re-adding the agents that we want. Conversation moderator, Sam, and Bob. We'll come down here and say OK. Now that's done, so I'm going to say OK on the workflow. And just to make sure, I'm going to click on this again and see what happened. Okay. So it looks like everything is correct now. We have the agents that we want. So let's say OK and go back to the playground and try our session again. So I'm going to make a new session with the tech conversation workflow. I'm going to click on create, and I'm going to give it a simple message to start, such as please begin. And this is going to take a moment to execute, so I'm going to cut to when it's done. All right, so it looks like our conversation has concluded, so let's go back and take a look at what happened. So if we scroll back up, we can see that the user proxy relays the initial message, please begin. Conversation moderator welcomes the two debate agents. Sam gives its argument. Bob gives its argument. Conversation moderator chimes in, back to Bob, back to Sam. And so the agents continue with a fascinating conversation about the pros and cons of advanced technology in daily life. So there you have it. So that was a lot of material to cover, but hopefully by now you have a good general grasp of what you can do with Autogen Studio and how you can use it to essentially prototype out agents and interactions between them. Making this video required a lot of source material, so I'm going to post links to everything that I used in the description below. This will include links to previous videos that I've made, as well as links to gists for those videos. I'm going to post links to several articles that I used to learn about Autogen Studio. I highly recommend you check them out because there's good information there, as well as links to other YouTube videos that also cover this same subject material. I would also like to thank Ben Williams and History is Absurd for requesting this video. If there's any other topics that you would like to see covered, please let me know in the comments below. So have fun with this. Let me know if you come up with anything cool, and I will talk to you next time.